gewinnen diese. Like that? And it says like that? Let's see what you say.
One between them?
Have we tested? Has they tested the?
Is this working? Yes. Okay, well, hello, good morning. Welcome everybody on this glorious morning here in Jaipur. This morning we will be speaking about David Gilmour's book, The Pursuit of Italy, and we have a wonderful panel of people. Let me briefly present to you the speakers, and then we'll get right to it. But we don't have a lot of time, and we are many people on the panel, so we'll have to be fairly quick. David Gilmour is a very prominent historian and biographer, actually also a journalist in his youth. I'll just mention 4 books that I think are relevant to this talk this morning, and one of them is a wonderful biography of Tomasi di Lampedusa called The Last Leopard. We have 2 biographies, one of Curzon and then another one on Rudyard Kipling called The Long Recessional, The Imperial Life of Rudyard Kipling. By the way, all of these books won important prizes. And then, of course, The Pursuit of Italy, about which we are talking this morning. And with us, we will have Tim Parks, who is here on my left, who is a very, very, very prolific author, novelist, essayist. He lives actually in Verona, and so has the very unique perspective of being, the true gentleman of Verona, who has a very particular perspective on the affairs of our country. He has written many, many books, but I'll just mention a few that seem particularly pertinent to us this morning. Italian Education, his other book, Italian Neighbors, which is the story of his settling into life in Verona. Another wonderful book called A Season with Verona, in which he tells the story of the Verona football team. And then another wonderful book on the Medici. It's called Medici Money, Banking, Metaphysics, and Art in the 15th century, Florence. And he has just told me, and then his latest book is also pertinent to our conversation this morning. It's called Italian. It's a book on Italian trains, and his journey on Italian trains. I will say that I mentioned that he lives in Verona. I will also say that he is an honorary citizen of Verona, and he was given the keys of the city. So really, quite an unusual person in Italy. And then we have to his left we have Carlo Pizzati, who is a well-known Italian journalist, and is now an author and a crime writer. And his latest book, correctly if I'm not mistaken, is Criminal, right?
It's
Yes.
not a crime book,
But
it's called Criminal.
it's called Criminal, yes. And he will bring also a very interesting perspective because he grew up in the Veneto and so has a few very interesting things to say about the shape of Italy today. And finally, last but not least, we have Rima Huija to my right. No need to introduce Rima. She's from Jaipur, and she's she started out as an archaeologist, but she just told me to say that she's a lapsed archaeologist in the sense that she doesn't practice anymore. I think of her mostly as an essayist, an academic, and a historian. And she's written several important books, two important biographies of one of a biography of Karni Singh, the Maharaja of Bikaner, and another wonderful book called Crusader for Self-Rule, a book on Tej Bahadur Sapru. But mostly, she is the author of a wonderful book, The History of Rajasthan. And so the reason we have her on our panel is because we thought it would be wonderful to bring in a Rajasthani perspective on this whole business of the Italian unity-disunity conundrum. And she's being a very good sport in tackling this complicated matter. But let us begin. But before I begin, I need a watch so that Tim can lend me his watch. The conversation here will run for about 45 minutes, and then we'll move on to questions. Okay, so to David's book, The Pursuit of Italy. I really can't. David has written not only a splendid book, but I think a really very important book, and one that has touched me deeply as an Italian who is not so used to hearing these things about his country. But of course, David does belong to a long tradition of British writers of Italian things. There's a long tradition of historians that certainly have shaped the way I have looked at the history of my country. I think of Trevelyan, I think of Dennis Mack Smith, I think of Paul Ginsberg, and more recently of someone like Christopher Duggan. In addition to all these, to this tradition, to which I think David, although formerly not a historian by training, I think he belongs to this tradition. But he is also, in his earlier incarnation, a journalist. And so he brings to the topic of Italy something more than simply the point of view of a historian. There is passion, there's a healthy dose of provocation. He's clearly trying to shake things up in this book and to give us an unusual, to my eyes, an unusual view of Italy. And most of all, he brings an extraordinary readability. It's a wonderfully written book. It's a pleasure to read. And so you constantly oscillate between the pleasure of the reading and the startling things he has to say about Italy. Anyway, I think very relevant to the debate today. We are having elections in a month in Italy. And the themes of this book play very well into the debate, today's debate in Italy. Now, of course, I grew up in Italy. I'm Italian, and to me, Italy looks like a boot, and so for that simple reason, it was always meant to be a nation state. I grew up thinking that I lived in a country where there was one language, where there was one nation, and we were all part of a single community. Instead, David, I think that someone like me grew in the belief that it's certainly inculcated by education and the schooling system that there is a continuous line between, say, the Rome of Augustus through the communes and through Renaissance, and then through Risorgimento. Then there was the accident of fascism. This is what we were taught. And then the history of Italy is renewed on this glorious path to the consolidation of the nation state. But David takes an entirely different view, and really sort of shatters all the myths of that I have grown up with. He claims that there is no such thing at Italy. There never was. There's too much of a diversity in languages and ethnicity and culture. Italy is not a nation today. It never was. The people that we associate with the unity of our country, from Virgil to Dante to Verdi, the pantheon of the national myth. Well, David claims that not even they had an idea of a national unity. So what he says essentially is that it's not because Italy looks like a boot that it has to be a nation state. And certainly he is much more in favor of a different configuration of the state, and about which he will talk about us now. He certainly is a proponent of the idea that Italy today and for a long time has been much less than the sum of its parts, I think. I do also think that I picked up in reading your book a sense of disappointment in the way things have developed, and at times even irritated disappointment at the way some of the key figures in Italy have sort of handled things. But to you now, David. Thanks.
Firstly, can I just check that the microphone is at the right distance? Can you hear? No? More closer. Okay. Well, Andrea, thank you for that introduction. You asked me earlier how if I could pinpoint a moment when this question interested me, and it did. Many years ago, I was having a dinner where there was a very distinguished Tuscan judge and a former Minister of Education, Paolo Rossi, who surprised me by saying, "You know, Davide, Garibaldi did Italy a big disservice. If he hadn't invaded Sicily and Naples, we in the north would have the richest and most civilized state in Europe." And then he paused and said, "Of course, we would have a neighbor to the south like Egypt." Now, I think that was a piece of northern prejudice. I don't think the Kingdom of Naples, had it survived, would have been like Egypt. But it was the early part of his remark that did interest me. And I think it does all of us who are always faced with the great contrasts in Italian achievement and not. And if you asked an opinion poll in Britain, you asked people which country has produced Europe's greatest artists, which has built its most beautiful cities, which has provided the world with its finest composers and singers, everybody would put Italy first, or maybe second, but certainly like that. And if you ask some other questions, like which country has developed the world's best cuisine, or which contains the world's loveliest man-made landscapes, or which has provided the most stylish designs in clothes and motor cars and things like that. And people again would put Italy right at the top of the Premier League. But if they were asked which country was the best governed, which was the least corrupt, which was able to deal best with the problems of organized crime, then Italy wouldn't be in the Premier League, or indeed even the one below that. So it's very interesting why there's so little correlation between the strength of the civilization of a culture and the weakness in being able to run that country. And I think that it comes back to the formation of a nation state 150 years ago, and actually the imposition of that state on a country where regional diversity was so strong, where historically, culturally, and sentimentally regionalism is very strong, as it indeed still is. If you go to Pisa and ask a citizen there to identify himself, he will say he is a Pisan, then he's a Tuscan, long before he would agree that he was an Italian or European. And this, we will talk later about the astonishing strength and culture of Venice, but lots of other parts of Italy have their own very important traditions as well. I mean, in Tuscany, another very diverse, you know, and even within Tuscany, the diversity is quite staggering. You can always tell whether a painting is done by a Sienese painter or a Florentine painter, whether a church is built in which particular one of the provinces. And we were always, I was brought up, rather like Andrea, to think that the Risorgimento was a triumph for a young nation asserting itself. And we were told that all the old states of Italy were decadent and they had to go. But actually that's not true. I mean, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany in the 18th century was one of the most civilized states in Europe. It abolished the death penalty nearly 200 years before we abolished it in Britain. But this great wealth of diversity in Italy was very much ignored by the founders of the state in 1861. They didn't want to have Sicilians and Venetians and any more. They wanted to have Italians, and they wanted to make Italian soldiers. They wanted to make them conquerors. They wanted to make Italy to become a great power. They wanted to make them colonialists. Eventually they wanted to make them fascists. And this project, what Massimo d'Azeglio called making Italians, ended in impoverishment, and it ended in the disaster of the Second World War. Now, of course, after the Second World War, Italy changed a great deal. It became the most denationalized state in Europe. Its two main political parties had international ideologies, communism and Christian democracy. And though Italy changed a great deal and made astonishing economic progress, by becoming one of the great economies of the world in that period, it has never solved the problem of how to run the state. And that's why the electoral system sort of changes every few years. And it comes back to that fundamental problem that the Italian people don't feel the sort of loyalty to the state and to its institutions as one would expect from a successful nation state.
Thank you, David. So you do realize why I felt this book was hitting me like a sledgehammer, really. Because I grew up thinking, and with me many millions of other Italians, that the process of Italian unification was a sort of natural, gradual, and really inexorable process. And so to read David's book and the wealth of information and his very cogent arguments suggesting an entirely that our destiny would have been so much better had we chosen a different path, mainly a much looser configuration in which the various regions in the country could maintain their autonomy and their cultural diversity and richness. That's really what we are talking about here. So, as I said, very, very huge impact on me, this book. But I wanted to give the word to Tim now, because Tim, as I said, lives in Verona, and he brings to this whole conundrum a very interesting perspective of someone who has actually lived for something like close to 30 years, I believe, more than 30 years, in an important Italian region, in an important Italian city. And so I'm very keen to hear from him, his take on what David has just told us, and his book. Before giving him the mic, I do want to ask him one question, and that is, I have heard over the years, and I don't know whether this is legend or not, that in addition to being an honorary citizen of Verona, you were also given an important prize by the local authorities, or some local authority, for not having written a disparaging article on the city you lived in. Is that legend? Is it true? Or
Very, very briefly, I was invited by the Daily Mail to write a negative article about Verona because Sarkozy was going to go there with his beautiful Carla. And I wrote a very brief email back saying, dear Daily Mail, I very much, enjoy the city I live in and can see no reason why I would put my situation here in jeopardy because you dislike Sarkozy. Then a week later, the Arena called me up saying, have you seen this terrible article about Verona by Tobias Jones? And I said, no, I haven't seen it, but I know how it happened. And I just sent them the email exchange between myself and the Daily Mail. So as a result of not writing something, I finally became an honorary citizen. All the many, many things I have written about the place went totally ignored. So that is the fate of a writer. Let me give my perspective on this, which is rather different from David's. I've lived in Italy 32 years, most of it in Verona. I've recently moved to Milan. For about the last 20 years, I've commuted between Verona and Milan, where I teach a postgraduate degree course in translation to students from all over Italy. So we have all their regional differences coming together in questions of how we translate English texts. How can I get into this as quickly as possible? Verona is considered a kind of pariah city in Italy, supposedly racist, and some people believe separatist. I think it's much exaggerated. In particular, the Verona football fans are considered some of the worst and most unpleasant people in the country. I was for 10 years a season ticket holder with Verona and traveled with these fans. To give you an idea of their sense of regional identity, when we travel to Vicenza, which is 30 or 40 kilometers to the east, we have a huge banner which says, ever since 1300, when the Scaligeri, those are the Veronese dukes, when the Verona people go to Vicenza, the ground trembles. Okay. When we go to Naples, obviously, we sing disparaging songs about San Gennaro, who is the patron saint of Naples. When we go to Puglia, we sing songs about Africans. When we go to Sicily, there is inevitably the Forza Etna chant, that is in favor of a volcanic eruption. The great comedies are when one goes to a city like Udine, with which Verona has no quarrel at all, and then it's very difficult to invent an insult, but much effort is made. I think terremotati was the last. Yeah. Great. People who have suffered an earthquake victims. Well, when I say all this, these fans all have wives from Puglia or from Naples. They all travel on their holidays with great pleasure to these places. They work alongside people from Vicenza or Milan. And this whole scenario is a rhetoric of reinforced identity which has no reality at all politically. And I have not met a single person in Verona in all my days who would ever dream of dying to separate the Veneto from Italy. The conversation in Italy in which a person whispers to you that the Risorgimento was a great mistake is a conversation one rapidly becomes familiar with after about 2 or 3 years in the country, and is frequently repeated. And there is a great frisson, again, of identity and local identity when this is announced. None of it transfers into any very serious political action. And even the Lega Nord, I believe, is more of a pressure group to bring more wealth to the north than in any sense a separatist organization. So let me just say that my picture of Italy, which I believe Italians way back into the Risorgimento, into the Renaissance and before, had a strong sense that the peninsula, although divided by language and divided geographically by its mountains, was nevertheless a space in which the peoples of that country were in relation to each other, very much as the Greeks in ancient Greece. Machiavelli, describing the situation in Italy during the period of Lorenzo de' Medici's battles against Naples and against Rome, makes it clear that those battles immediately disappeared when there was any sign of an invasion from Turkey, from the Islamic kingdom at the time, an empire of Turkey. So what happens in Italy is very similar to one of those families where you know it's a family because they're all arguing with each other and saying how much they'd like to live on their own. But at the same time, immediately any force from outside presents itself, that family knows that it is a family against those outside forces. And in the Risorgimento movement, which I do not believe was without a very strong patriotic element, admittedly with a small number of people, as is almost always the way with revolutions. There were very many people who understood that the centuries of complete economic decay into which many parts of Italy, albeit not Tuscany, had fallen, was very largely due to the fact that the country was occupied by Austrians, had been occupied, of course, for many centuries by the Spanish, and they genuinely felt the need to bring this country together. Today, traveling around Italy, I recently made a trip to the south for the book about trains, and was startled to find how easy it was. I feared that the southern dialects would be too difficult for me. Instead, I find everybody speaking very much among themselves as well, a fairly standard Italian. So, however negative the imposition of a national language may have been, apart from places in Taranto and Puglia where local dialects were very strong, I must say that the whole business of imposing this language has in fact been successful, and very similar, of course, to the history of many countries, Britain amongst them, at a much earlier moment in time.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for that. That was very interesting from your personal experience. Carlo, you bring yet a different perspective to this because you grew up in the Veneto. You are Italian, however, and so, however, in the sense that, unlike Tim, you are an Italian, but you grew up in the Veneto, and so you have a perspective on this whole issue of regionalism versus national unity.
Yes, yeah. I also has to be reminded that this book is the history of Italy from the Neolithic to Berlusconi. And if you live in Italy, you see the connection between the Neolithic and Berlusconi. So, having said that, and because we are in election period, I suppose, Tim Parks actually is much more of a Veneto than I am because he's lived there 33 years, longer than I have, because I've been a bit nomadic. But I have grown up in the hinterland, the dark heart of Veneto, Valdagno, where I say dark heart because it's the place where it rains the most in northern Italy, and it produces writers as a result. And where the first politicians of the Venetian League was elected in 1979. So I have a very clear perspective of that. And unfortunately, I'm afraid I was invited to probably counteract or criticize the theory of this book, but the only thing I worry about is if David Gilmour has found a publisher in Italy yet, and I don't think he has.
No, Mondadori kept it for about 2 months before. No, they haven't.
That you don't have it, right? Okay, well, that's the point for me. Because I personally think there should be a textbook, a school textbook in Italy. And I think it will be a very healthy habit to begin reading textbooks written from writers from other countries to have a proper perspective. For example, I don't know, the UK could have an Indian historian writing the history of the UK. That would be interesting. And maybe a Chinese could write the history of India, although William Dalrymple has already got that covered, I think. So a Tibetan monk could write the history of China, of course. But it's difficult to accept that. That's why you have not found a publisher, and that's why Panorama magazine, when reviewing your book, which again I think it's excellent, and I read it saying yes, 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 said that if you read 3 or 4 history books that have been written about Italy by Italians, you more or less will get the point, but it's not true. Because Italians are engaging since the Risorgimento, as you explained in the book, in self-censorship and in propaganda about their own history, I think. So I have a hard time counteracting with your theories because they by coincidence, sorry that I do have an Italian passport, but I agree 100%. And not because I'm from the Northern League, because I think one of the parties that did most damage to Italy in the last 20 years, betraying its base. Because I think what the theory is, it is not that it is simply economic based, the desire of the Northern League to create a non-existent country called Padania in the north, which is what they're trying to do. But they actually answered a call by a large part of the population, which is documented by the opinion polls, for some sort of independence. In the Veneto now, aside from the fact that I did a documentary for Italian TV Rai 3 on the green shirts, the security service of the Northern League, in which I saw quite a few people declaring they were willing to die. Of course, Italians love to talk more about their emotion and not act on it, and the book explains why. But I think in the end, if you look at the most recent surveys done in Veneto by independent polls, they've asked, would you vote yes in a referendum in the independence of the Venetia, the state Veneto? And the results swing from 80% to 53%. So there is a wide majority in independently carried out opinion polls that would ask for that. And there is a movement, just like in Scotland, in Catalonia, and in the Basque regions, for simply asking to respect the UN Charter of Human Rights and the right of self-determination of the people, to call for a referendum. So there is a serious movement, aside from the old political manipulation of the Northern League. There are several serious movements that are acting upon the conclusion of this book. And the conclusion is, Italy thrives when it is divided. It is difficult for us to accept that because we grew up imbued with the Risorgimento propaganda, but that's why I think the book does an excellent job. We do thrive in healthy competition, and now we don't have an exterior enemy who's about to invade our country. We have a globalized economy, and it has been proven by economists and historians how smaller countries thrive more than large countries that were built in protectionist eras, like the 18th century when Italy was born, for example. And that is why Slovenia now has a GPA per capita, which is higher than that of Italy.
Okay, Carlo. Well, actually, yes, I was hoping he would come to the defense of the Italian state, but he was he didn't rise to the occasion, and in fact passed on the other camp. But I want to bring in Rima now, who has the very arduous but fascinating task of trying to draw a parallel between the country of the 100 kingdoms and the diversity of India, working within a national framework. I will say one thing. Before coming to India, I haven't been here since 1975, so it's really like if I'm coming here for the first time. But so I was asking my friends in Italy, I was telling them, I'm going to Jaipur to the festival. Oh, you're going to India? Well, you'll see, it's just like Italy. And this I kept hearing over and over until yesterday. I was in Delhi briefly before coming here. The Italian ambassador kindly asked us for lunch, and sure enough, halfway into the conversation, he leans over and says, "Well, haven't you noticed?" And he says, "No, what is it?" "Well, India is just like Italy." So, which coming from the Italian ambassador, I thought was very peculiar. But I was wondering if you think that India is at all like Italy, and we can actually use this paradigm to talk about your country as well.
Well, since you brought that up, I think I should say buongiorno as being the only non-Italian on this, because you didn't use that word. But I've been sitting here thinking, are we talking about Italy or are we talking about India? It applies so much. No, some of the things I do want to bring in, which is why at the end of it I'm as confused about my reaction to the brief glimpse I've had of your book, is like you, Andrea, I grew up with a certain image of India. Now, India is relatively younger as a nation state, not as a nation, not as a people, but it's relatively younger as a nation state as compared to Italy, 1947. And the image I grew up with, of course, had a map. Yours has a boot, ours was drawn in a certain way. But because it's younger, my parents' generation would have drawn India, because they learned it in school, with a different shape. Because until 47, there was a lot more to it. And at some point when I decided I should learn more about the world, there was an aborted attempt to read Fayan's journey, in translation obviously, to India. And somewhere around Central Asia, he says, I'm approaching India. And then he gets to what is now the Peshawar part of Pakistan, and he says, I'm entering India. I'm entering Central India, or something of the sort. To me, Central India, the way we've grown up, where some people in the audience would relate to, is a portion of India which is well south of Rajasthan. But still, that's what we grew up with. We grew up with this whole thing of, the nation state, patriotism, with variations. I've actually got the national flag colors on me, which again are a bit similar to your national flag, variations in the color. So, a lot of what India today has come about, again, for patriotic reasons. There is a nation state, and we were part of this whole ideology of you come together for something. Within it, there are so many diversities. Fortunately for us, Carlo, growing up again, one of the mottos on the school thing was unity in diversity, and I think one of our politicians had coined it, so it was being used. So, possibly by the 1950s, the world was realizing more and more that equalizing everything was not necessarily the answer, and celebrating diversity, not so much the melting pot, but acknowledgement, would have helped. So yes, we have this whole issue of their languages, which are recognized, their regional languages, but they're constitutionally recognized. You can use them in parliament. You can think of the chaos that would cause to translators, but they manage all the same. But you also have something like a standard Hindi, which is taught in schools. And growing up, I had this interesting experience of we would go in somewhere. If you spoke to a certain generation, they would reply in the local dialect from within Rajasthan, which is roughly the size and shape of France. So even within Rajasthan, we have a lot of... And the younger lot would, to show off that they had learned Hindi and maybe English, depending on their little local school, they would translate for the elders. So that is the kind of India that one was growing up with.
Thank you, Rima. Well, it just, this brings to mind, I mean, I thought we'd do a second round talking about, but something else has come up. I mean, I'm now beginning to wonder whether we can continue to celebrate, I mean, we all agree about the cultural diversity, the different dialects and language, the richness, etc. So my question is, can we continue to celebrate these richnesses within the same frame, within the same boundaries, as it were? Is it a question of adjusting the framework in order to so that the whole is more than the sum of its parts? I mean, you see an evolution in that sense. I mean, is it a question of adjusting?
I think I do see an evolution in that sense. I don't know if I can give a value judgment and say it's better.
Right.
Because certainly to go by what you've described in your book about the richness of certain periods of,
Right.
say, Italian history, which would coincide with
Right.
certain phases in any part
Yeah.
of the world, India. I think that would be more a question of who is providing patronage,
Right.
and then who has the time and leisure to, go in for the creative arts, who is being stifled at what point. So maybe the future can be all bright if we are broad-minded enough. But if at the same time you have a situation of, I remember this scene from whichever the Antony and Cleopatra film was, if that's the title, the Liz Taylor one, in which you have the Roman Forum there, and then they say, where is the enemy, where is Egypt? And they look at the minister, and the spear is thrown at that minister. So if you get narrow-minded, you don't have creativity, and you can have regionalism, and you can have parochialism, which may not be the way forward. And or you can have the way nation states are now working out. You don't necessarily have the nation state as rigid as it used to be, and yet nationalism, patriotism, in some places they mean a lot. In other countries, those are maybe dealt with in a different way.
Let me get back to David, because time is running out, and I really wanted to get his perspective on things. You mentioned at some point in your book, and we were mentioning Venice before, but there's a moving moment in your book in which you say, he's talking about the Venetian Republic, which collapsed in 1797 when Napoleon came over the Alps, and so this thousand-year-long republic died, though after Napoleon fell in 1814, there was perhaps the possibility that the Venetian Republic could somehow become a nation state again. And you say in the book something like it could have gone another way. It could have been different. Venice did not have to die the way it did. And today perhaps it would be a small, wealthy, culturally diverse and interesting state like Holland in the context of Europe. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that and try to configure it in what ideally your Italy would be today?
Well, I think people don't remember that the Republic of Venice was the most successful state in the history of the West. And that 1,000 years you mentioned, that's longer than ancient Rome. And during that period, Venice never suffered a successful revolution, never successful coup d'etat, or indeed an invasion until the ghastly Napoleon came in, took it away, gave it to the Austrians, they took it back again. But after Napoleon fell at the Congress of Vienna, nearly all the states went back. The only two states to what they were before Napoleon, the only two states that didn't were the republics, the Republic of Genoa and the Republic of Venice. And I think that was because everybody was so frightened of the idea of republic, we want to go back to monarchies. It would be now obviously impossible to go back to this idea that it could have been like the Netherlands. But, and I'm not suggesting we should go back to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany either. But I think Italy should go, I actually don't think Indians and Italians are there's a very similar situation. And I think the founders of independent India were much wiser in their respect for the provinces than the early founders of Cavour and so on of United Italy. But I think if Italy is going to have a future, the Northern League's not going to go away. It will have to become what it should have been all along, which is a federal state with much more responsibility and autonomy within a federal structure.
Federal state, Tim?
Now, I just must say, first of all, that the newspapers do report David's point of view quite frequently in Italy, and certainly running up to the 150th year of the celebration of the state, there was an enormous amount of controversy about the Risorgimento, where David's position was being very strongly put by many people, and obviously in the Veneto. I must also wonder, Carlo, when you left the Veneto, Because hearing you talk is like hearing somebody talk 20 years ago. It is absolute nonsense to suggest that in the Veneto today there is a majority for independence. It is simply...
It's a survey.
It is it is simply not true. I need to see it.
I would send it
The Lega Nord in the Veneto is rapidly losing consensus. This party is almost disappearing. It produces a newspaper called Padania, which can't even pay its people anymore because it doesn't sell any copies. This is simply not on the agenda. This is not what is being talked about in Italy today. The left-right divide left over from the Second War is just infinitely more important.
But it's talked about in the Wall Street Journal, in the Los Angeles Times, in the international media are talking about this, and I will send you all the links. In Italy, it is not being
Well,
talked
it's
about,
being talked about by them because they like to imagine that this is happening, but it's not the case.
They
I
see
also
the
say-
surveys, and they see
Well,
that the surveys say
finish,
that.
and then you can speak for a moment. Let me say that, for example, a book by Lucy Rial, her book, which very much which very much sort of tried to give us a picture of Garibaldi as much less than a hero, etc., etc., was indeed translated into Italy and includes in it all the traditional left-wing communist criticism of the Risorgimento. These matters are not... It is true that at school the national position is taught, but it's also true that my children, who came up through Italian schools, all have a very strong sense that the Risorgimento was not a great heroic movement. They have not been in any sense brainwashed by modern Italian schooling. So for me, living there now, me every day in Milan, in Verona, what you're saying just seems like I'm hearing it from outer space, frankly.
Like I said, you're much more of an Italian than I am, in the sense that you are much more attached to the idea of United Italy, because that's what you experienced living
Okay,
there.
okay. We have to bring this alas to a close. But I was glad that at least someone here championed the cause. No, I'm just.
Yeah. I am just
No,
mentioning.
I tend to
I am just
agree with
mentioning-
Tim. Anyway.
But wait,
Exactly.
can I ask a
No,
question
no,
then? Just one question. You are saying that you would be happy to live in a free Veneto, so... No, but I just ask you a question. If there were a referendum for the independence of Veneto or the Venetia, what would you vote? If you were entitled to vote, as you should be because you've been living there so long, if there were a referendum for the independence of the Venetia, so honestly, deep from your heart, Tim, tell me, what would you vote? Now, what would you do? No. Okay.
You would probably vote no.
But
Okay.
the majority. But do you understand that the majority of the people in Veneto say that, in opinion polls,
Okay, as you
yes.
all can see, Carlo, as you all can see,
I'll send it to you.
a lot is going on in Italy. We don't know what it will look like in 10 or 15 years, so stay tuned. But in the meantime, we have 10 minutes to take some questions from the... Yes, how do I do this?
Hello. I've been listening to the discussion in which...
Wait, who is this for?
Pardon?
Who is the question for?
Question is to Mr. David Gilmore. And as Madam has said about India and Italy being almost, same with the diversity. And you have written so many books on India also. And why did not that same idea occur in the case of India as it came in the case of Italy to you?
Well, no, yes, but the India I've written about is very much the British-Indian connection in a historical sense, and of the administration of the, especially of the Indian civil service in the 19th century, and this was before the question, before the foundation of the Indian National Congress. So I was dealing with a very, very different subject, and I wouldn't feel qualified to write about modern India or the way that it was formed.
Next question. Question here.
My question is for any one of you. As I personally share a thought that Italy and India are quite similar, I would like to have your views as per whether a very strong local or regional identity nowadays actually help either Italians or Indians to be more open to the world and be, let's say, modern, nomadic, global citizens.
I'm the Italian who lives in India part of the time. But speaking of Italian and Indians, if I could quote Salman Rushdie, he just said that Indians are like Italians without the wine, that's all. And I think you have good wine now. In the tradition of Venice, the history of which I know, and Andrea knows quite well, and David as well, and Tim, I wouldn't call it regionalist because it was a nation, one of the longest republics in history. Definitely diversity was the integral part of that culture. So the question is whether or not a smaller state promotes diversity. In the case of Venice, there is historical data. You remember Othello from Shakespeare? That proves how much more diversified and open it was, and even evolved, as David mentioned, Grand Ducato di Toscana abolishing the death penalty. So it's not that larger nations necessarily are more open to diversified into globalization. Venice was actually much more open to globalism than Italy is today, even in its laws, I think. So that would be my answer.
Okay, I think that was pretty clear. The answer, at least according to this panel, is yes. Regional diversity in small entities does not impede an opening to the world, and on the contrary, might be helpful. Another question? Yes?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes?
Question for the panelists, actually. Perhaps if you could share your views between, as far as Italians living in Italy, people who've been living in Italy, and now that you've been in India and you're getting to know a little bit about India, your views between Italy and India vis-a-vis, let's say, in the last 10 years, where there has been a lot of improvement both in India, but at the same time, there's a lot of change that has been taking place within Italy. I don't want to say whether it's good, bad. That's something for all of you perhaps to say. But it'd be interesting to get your views. Let's say if we can keep it to the last 10 years, I think that'll be quite relevant for all of us to see how you feel vis-a-vis Italy and in India, and perhaps going forward. That could be quite interesting. Thank you.
Anyone want to take this?
I say one of the areas where I totally agree with David is the Italian difficulty in running the state, and the tendency, because they do constantly form themselves into, as it were, opposed factions rather than parties, which are actually not always, indeed mainly not, regional in nature, makes it almost impossible to make major reform get underway in Italy. And the last 10 years, particularly since the entry into the euro, have seen radical decline economically in Italy, which I feel very closely. Again, I teach postgraduate students. I try to help them find work. Part of my job is to put them in connection with companies and so on, or publishers who might be interested. I'm teaching translators. We now have 37% youth unemployment in Italy. That is scandalously high. and the sense of decline is everywhere around us at this particular moment. Let me say, though, that said again, at the general election which is coming up, sadly it seems to me that none of the people presenting their programs are really taking on the economic issues involved. Certainly the whole question of any separation of the country is simply not on the agenda at all, and not being talked about at this moment. It is a desperately depressing moment, actually. It was said before that we don't have an enemy now. Well, in fact, as far as the newspapers are concerned, we have the enemy of a German and a European community which wants to force us in Italy to follow certain restrictive economic measures and so on, which perhaps are not entirely suitable at this moment. But anyway, the sense for the last 10 years in Italy has definitely been one of depression and decline.
Yes, you haven't mentioned the striking fact of the last 10 years that Italy was run for most of that time by a man who would be unelectable in any other country and would probably almost certainly be in jail. A man who came to power promising one thing he could do: he could run a football club, he could run a property business, he could run a media enterprise, he could run Italy and make it a wealthy place. And during his time, Italy's economic growth rate was lower than any other country in the world except for Haiti and Zimbabwe.
I will just add to that, in terms of, were you trying to evoke a relationship between Italy and India at this, well, I'll just take it up from there. Right, yeah. Right. Well, but the thing is that Italy is going through this very difficult moment on which Tim just touched now, and David too. India, on the other hand, seems to be in an entirely different phase of its history, very much on the ascendance and thriving, a great deal of energy. Which strikes you the most when you arrive in India from Italy is exactly that sense of doom and gloom that you feel in Italy, and then this sudden burst of energy that you feel coming here. This is a very superficial reaction I'm giving just because I've been here just 2 days. I do think that the two countries, I'm not talking about regions now, I'm talking about the nation state and India, Italy and India, would potentially have a huge potential to work together. I think they're a perfect fit on many levels. However, I think what is missing now to make things work better between Italy and India in terms of trade and sort of a richer relationship is the fact that, as Tim was saying, the people running the government machinery, the policy-making people, are really not doing a very good job of making the most of a situation which could benefit Italy very much. I strongly believe that if Italy could forge a stronger relationship with India, it would certainly benefit our economy, it would benefit our mid-sized industry and so on. But for that to happen, you do need, and in this case I tend to see the importance of a state government, national government, vis-à-vis the smaller regional governments who have lesser clout in terms of trade negotiation and so on. The government deficit weighs tremendously on this situation. One last question, I think? No, we have to close it. Alas. Okay, well listen, thanks so much for coming. Again, by David Gilmour, The Pursuit of Italy, a wonderfully provocative book with a wonderful cover. If you're asking yourself what this white circle is on the cover, it is the light of a Vespa. And Vespa as a unifying theme for Italy would be probably a very good topic for our next lecture.
For Italy and India. We have
and
Vespa
India as well.
scooters.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
David, Rima, Andrea, Carlo and Tim, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the next session at Baithak is The Face Behind the Mask. We will begin in about 15 minutes from now. Thank you very much.